Welcome to Elysium Theatre Company's Durham Shakespeare Festival podcast 2023, recorded with Durham University to mark the 400th anniversary of the publication of the First Folio. We present interviews with some of the leading Shakespearean actors and scholars in the UK. I'm Jake Murray, Artistic Director of Elysium Theatre Company, and with me is actor of stage and screen Robert Lindsay. Robert, thank you so much for doing this. Just to start off with, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how you started as an actor, what your first steps were.
Well, curiously, I'm never quite sure how to answer that question because I don't know is the answer how I started. I shouldn't. You know, my mother was a cleaner and my dad was a carpenter, and I come from a small mining village town in the East Midlands. And I went to a secondary modern school called Gladstone Boys, which was great for me because there was an art master there called John Lally, who I guess recognized that I had then the gift of the gab, as he called it, and he nurtured it. And he started a thing called the Grand Order of Thespians at secondary modern school. And I was made Grand Thespian, which I was very proud of at the time. I was 14, 15 years of age. And he started getting the whole school involved in putting on a school play. I guess that's where it all starts. But the theatre, certainly Shakespeare, was very, I guess that my feelings about Shakespeare at the time was it was what, and I hate to say it again because it sounds awfully class-ridden, what posh people did and what people who were well-spoken did and who were academics. And Shakespeare was something remote. But John Lally, organising this thing called the Thespians, I really started to find myself, as it were, and start to enjoy the fact that I could speak and make people listen, which is the beginning. And by the end of my year at Gladstone Boys, when I was 16 and I'd done my GCSEs, I wanted to go to Clarendon College in Nottingham, which was a drama course, to do my A-levels. And I had to audition. And John prepared me and he said, well, you have to do a Shakespearean piece. And I said, I've never done Shakespeare. He said, right, what we're going to do the speech from Henry V, the famous speech, and we're going to practice in the hall. And I want you to learn it, which I found really difficult at that age, having never done Shakespeare before. But I did, I learned it, and we were practicing on the stage on our own, and the school bell went, and all the classes suddenly emptied and came into the hall, and John shouted, quiet everybody, quiet. And he said very quietly to me, Robert, do the speech. And I said, sir, I can't. I looked around this thugs. I mean, you know, the school uniform, we're talking 1960? Yeah. But the school uniform was a leather jacket and a bike chain, you know, and they were all out to go to the toilets and have a fag. And he made them all stand there and I started the speech. And I got to the famous line, cry God for Harry, England and St. George. And the whole school cheered. It was a life-changing moment. I suddenly stood on the stage in front of my friends, colleagues and enemies, people who had never heard Shakespeare or even bothered to listen to Shakespeare. But somehow the resonance of that speech, obviously with those lads, had an incredible, I guess that was the launch pad, really. And thanks to John. It was always thanks to a teacher, isn't it? And then, of course, to your directors and your tutors at drama school. But it's interesting now, you know, my son is doing a course at RADA, and he said all the kids on the course are trying to avoid Shakespeare because they want to do movies. You know, I just wanted to work in the theatre. And with that Shakespearean moment for me was the beginning of wanting to do a lot of Shakespeare. So consequently, in my career now, I've done a lot of the plays, including Hamlet and Richard III and Much Ado About Nothing and Midsummer Night's Dream. I've done quite a few of them, both on screen and on stage. And I love it. And I've tried to persuade my son that you can reach people, but he's dyslexic. So he finds it very difficult to read Shakespeare. So I've said to him, then just learn it like I did when I was at school all those many years ago. I think probably I was dyslexic as well at the time. I first of all went to a college in Nottingham called Clarendon College, which was terrific. And there were two wonderful tutors there, John Wills, who then went to teach at the Royal Welsh College in Cardiff, who literally drummed out my Ilkeston accent, which was then very broad. And he deliberately chose for me a lot of D.H. Lawrence poems to read. And of course, I thought G.H. Lawrence I could just read in my own accent, having been born 4 miles from Eastwood. But no, there was one poem, Journée de Morte, the day of death. Along the avenue of cypresses go the scarlet cloaks and surplices of women. And I remember there was a long, and he said, no, Robert, no, there's a neutral vowel, there's no G. Along the avenue of cypresses, the scarlet cloaks and surplices of linen. From that to along the avenue of cypresses was a huge step. And that was before I went to RADA. And I guess it was a conscious decision because I guess I was maybe, if I'm being really honest, embarrassed about my roots, certainly embarrassed about my accent. And Pamela Barnard, who was my voice coach at RADA, said to me, you are an extremely versatile actor, Robert, and I think you'll be more versatile if you really have an RP accent.
In those days, that was very much part of the training, wasn't it? It didn't matter where you came from.
Yeah, I've had this argument with a few people, and they always say to me, well, Tom Courtenay and Albert Finney and Peter O'Toole and Richard Harris, and they all kept their accents. I suppose I've always got mine in reserve. Funnily enough, I'm about to start shooting Sherwood in Nottingham, written by James Graham. They did the first series last year very successfully, and they've asked me to play the lead in the new series starting in July. So I may have to use my own accent again. Wonder if I can.
It's quite an interesting story you're telling about how you started off thinking Shakespeare was something for posh people, and then you started to do it yourself. One could argue you adopted a posh accent, but when did you break through that barrier and feel comfortable with it? And what was that? What was it that made you suddenly feel this is mine, I can do this?
I did quite a lot of the famous floorboard Shakespeare's, or the wooden, as Trevor Peacock used to call it. And I started off doing Twelfth Night with Trevor, funny enough, who played Feste, and then Fabian, a small role, but I was it was my first sort of, I was very overexcited. And I went on to do All's Well That Ends Well, Midsummer Night's Dream when I played Lysander. And then I eventually played Giacomo in Cymbeline with Elijah Mashinsky, who was a director I worked with a lot. And I ended up doing Richard III with him at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And Much Ado, which was, I think Much Ado was the first time, because I've done a lot of situation comedies, and comedy was always my, I guess, angle of work. I've always loved that. I remember working at the Royal Exchange with Graham when we did Beau Stratagem, and I had lots of asides. And I remember Graham said to me, you have an amazing quality with an audience that I've never seen before. You seem to have a connection with them. He said, so I would, if I were you, really use the asides. So I started to use them like stand-up, where I pick on an individual in the audience. And of course, Shakespeare was fantastic for that. And certainly when I did Richard III at the RSC, his asides to the audience, I guess it was Bram who really pushed me in that route. I've slightly gone off a tangent now, haven't I, with the comedy?
What's really interesting about what you're saying is how much of the comedy you played. I remember the production of the Beau Stratagem, and I also remember my key memory was a moment where you did that with the audience. And you're absolutely right. I've directed a lot of plays since Shakespeare, and the loss of the aside to the audience, sometimes you really miss that ability to suddenly connect, which I think, as you say, really helps with the comedy.
Well, I think Shakespeare particularly was his asides. Well, when you think of the Globe, you had the audience there. You can talk to them directly. It's what they wanted. And then I guess that was my real breakthrough with Shakespeare, certainly from a comedic point of view. And then I used it in Hamlet that Bram directed, and Bram pushed me again, to find the humor in Hamlet, which a lot of actors avoid, because it is a tragic play. But I think humor is a very powerful weapon, which Shakespeare uses so brilliantly, with the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, his teasing of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. What was so wonderful about that production was that we took it to schools in the Northeast and the Northwest, secondary modern comprehensive schools that would not, like my school all those years before, would not entertain doing Shakespeare. And at the time, I was then doing a situation comedy called Citizen Smith, which was huge, certainly with kids. And I guess I tried to escape that. I know when I was doing a matinee once of Hamlet, and I was walking down the main road, and a builder shouted "Power to the people," and I just put my head on my hands, and I walked into the building, and I said to Bram, "I'm never ever going to lose that character. He's driving me crazy." And Bram said, "Come here, look out the window." He said, "You see that line of people? They're waiting for returns to see your Hamlet." I said, "No, they're waiting for Wolfie Smith playing Hamlet." And he said, "Doesn't matter. You are bringing them to Shakespeare for the first time. So remember that. You have a big responsibility."
We'll have quite a lot of young listeners to this who won't know necessarily that production, but it was a landmark production. I remember it very well. I remember it was done with almost rehearsal clothes, wasn't it? There was no set, no props.
Bram and I had many, many fights over it. I have to say, it was the only time. Bram and I worked many times before, and I guess he was the one that really introduced me to serious theatre, which the Royal Exchange really changed my life and my direction, because I was very caught in lots of TV, and I was being offered lots of TV, and I became a bit of a teen idol, I guess, doing Citizen Smith, which I didn't really enjoy. I just lost my way, I guess. And I think it was Bram who brought me back and made me realize why I started in this profession. But Hamlet, I remember the tour we did in the tent, which was the kind of model of the Royal. We ended on the roof of the Barbican above the Royal Shakespeare Company. But I remember a lot of the venues were schools in assembly halls where the tent was set up. So there was a kind of really, and I remember the cast in the changing rooms getting ready, and you could hear the kids, we went to one school in Liverpool, and it was a really tough school. And I heard them kind of, it's going to be it's awful, this is going to be terrible, And there was absolute silence all the way through it. And I realized the power of the language. And it was great because none of them were doing A-levels and none of them were reading the books, which happened a lot at the Royal Exchange, because it was an A-level book at the time. And I could see a lot of the kids reading the book and not watching the play. So I would be very naughty and change the dialogue so they look up.
I think what you say is brilliant, because everything you're talking about is breaking down that tangle that we have about Shakespeare, the idea that it's incomprehensible, that it's aloof, that it's esoteric, that it's elitist. Whereas in fact, the stories are very, very direct.
Oh, Lord, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the plays are very... Cymbeline I had a lot of problems with. I think Cymbeline is a fantastic story, and Yakima was a wonderful character to play. I played with Helen Mirren, funnily enough, at the BBC. Creaky Floorboard production, Cedric Messina was the producer, while I remembered.
Again, but I remember all those Shakespeares on television. They were massive. Everybody watched them. And in the sense, it brought Shakespeare into everybody's living room.
No. When you say everybody, we all middle-class people watched them.
Well, okay.
They didn't watch them. They were certainly not in the Downton Abbey, or even, in my day, Citizen Smith, which was getting 27 million viewers. I'd be interested to see what viewers levels they got. Be interesting. I might even do that actually later. Have a look. But be there. We all watched them, of course we did, and there were some wonderful ones. My friend Ron Cook was fantastic in Richard III. I think John Cleese did Taming the Shrew.
Trickio.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. And there was, the David Suchets, and the Anthony Hopkins did one, I remember. I think everybody did one.
I think what's interesting about, again, what you're saying is that in those days, performing Shakespeare was the yardstick. If you wanted to prove that you were a great actor, you played the great roles in Shakespeare, you handled the language, you did that span. And I think what you've just described about young actors not wanting to do Shakespeare is a side of how the culture shifted in terms of how we see it.
I think, it's not changed since my day. I mean, when I worked at the Royal Exchange, I was still shooting backwards and forwards to London to do some comedy series or some other Shakespeare or whatever on TV. And, Casper and Michael used to say to me, you really should concentrate on your passion. And I say, I think because of where I came from, I was so preoccupied with money, because my family were very poor. And I think that's the danger. And I think the shift now is it's so lucrative, the world of Netflix and Amazon and Apple TV and America and movies. And it is glamorous, that kind of world. So a lot of kids are attracted. I'm just shocked that a rather course who offers Shakespeare is dismissed by kids. They want to do camera work.
Well, because the tradition of Shakespearean training at RADA is pretty fundamental. Just for listeners, Braham, Casper, and Michael is Braham Murray, Casper Rader, and Michael Elliott, who were the founders of the Royal Exchange Theatre in Manchester that you've been talking about with such affection. Going back a second to all that comedy you've played, because Shakespearean comedy is much loved, but it's not easy to play, is it? A lot of people find it difficult. A lot of the ones that a lot of the characters you're describing, Benedict and Iachimo, they're more wits, aren't they, than clowns? How did you enjoy that?
Well, the Iachimo was on screen. I think when I had the freedom in the theatre, I mean, Richard III is a fantastic wit, dangerous wit. And I mean, my connection with the audience, certainly on Richard III, could be very exciting. And also it could be a problem because one particular night, in fact, it was the first night at the Savoy Theatre after we finished our run at Stratford, we came into London, was huge. It was a massive success. I'm not sure about the critics, but I didn't read them at the time. But I remember coming on, and a lot of my performance was connected to the audience. So everything, whenever I was alone, I would find members of the audience, which worked brilliantly until one particular night when I started, Now is the Winter of Our Discontent, and I heard the lines being spoken by someone else. And I carried on, and the second line was spoken by someone else, and the third line. And I looked down, and there on the front row was a guy with his feet on the stage, and I stared at him, and he stared back at me. And I carried on, and he carried on speaking the lines with me. So I leaned over and I said, if you know the lines better than me, why don't you get up and say them? And he looked so shocked, and he said, because I'm not as good an actor as you, Mr. Lindsay. And the entire cast were gathered in the wings watching this confrontation. So I said, let me do the performance then. He said, oh, absolutely. I'm terribly sorry. And he was fine. The connection had been made, and the audience were wonderful. I got this huge round of applause for stopping him, and then carried on. As an actor friend of mine, Michael Simpkins, who was in it, who writes books about performing and things, who thinks it's his story. Anyway, I love that. I think, the connection I made in Hamlet and Richard III, which began in the Beau Stratagem with Braham in the Royal Exchange, has really helped me with finding the humanity in everything that I play in Shakespeare, because everything he writes is so human.
Yes. And I think also what you're putting your finger on is that although Richard III and Hamlet are tragic figures, they're also brilliant wits. There's a scathing wit to them. And Hamlet uses it to disguise himself and to work out his frustrations. And Richard is angry and enjoys exposing people and making fun, and you're right that I think all the way through Shakespeare, like Iago, you've got these characters who carry the audience with them through that direct connection, and it is something that's gone from our stage. Playwrights don't really write that anymore, and we forget that Shakespeare was popular entertainment in that way.
Oh, without doubt. I mean, hugely popular. And of course, the Globe is doing terribly well. I haven't seen a production there, and I've been asked to do something which I couldn't do. And I think perhaps that would be rather nice. I'd rather enjoy that. And there are two plays I would love to do, The Tempest and King Lear. They're two pretty good plays and two wonderful roles as well.
And they're roles you've not played?
No. And Chichester asked me to go down and do Tempest a couple of years ago. Again, I couldn't do it. And then we have friends of mine approached the National.
Going back to those two roles, so the appeal of Lear is really obvious. I mean, it's a Titanic part, it's a great part. What is it about Prospero that appeals to you?
I guess the age and having children and being isolated. And I guess, when you get older and you start thinking in terms of what you can and can't play now, there are very few roles, certainly Shakespearean roles, that are left that you can play. I mean, Malvolio's one I could still do. Been asked to do him a few times. That's a lovely role. I love Twelfth Night. I loved Trevor Nunn's production at the RSC when they were at the Old Witch years and years ago with Donald Sinden, and it was all Christmas and Christmas trees, and they were all on ice skates. It was skating rink. And it was just so magical. I've seen wonderful productions. Midsummer Night's Dream at the Lyric in Hammersmith, which was genius. Comic. It was a theatre group where Bottom hadn't been cast, and they were expecting Ian McKellen to. He was stuck in the lift, so they asked a member of the audience to come up and play Bottom. There was the things you're able to do with Shakespeare.
You mentioned Midsummer Night's Dream and Bottom. There's a fascinating thing I discovered. I directed it with students a few years ago in Newcastle College. Students who, to begin with, were really hostile to the Shakespeare and ended up loving it and having a real ball with it. With the language being the initial barrier, but then when they overcame that, they really enjoyed it. Is that apparently there's a critical tradition about that play that for hundreds of years the complaint was that the mechanicals were in it too much, that the focus on the working class characters was too great. And if you look at the other Shakespearean comedies, As You Like It, Much Ado About Nothing, Twelfth Night, they're primarily about aristocrats and dukes and generals and big families. It's Midsummer Night's Dream which brings this beating heart of the play, is this group of working class characters who you fall in love with, and they're funny, but their humanity is immense. And I think Bottom is one of those great roles, I think. And it really struck me when I discovered that was a problem for hundreds of years that people had with the play. And that made me think differently about Shakespeare and his whole approach to class.
Well, maybe that goes back to the class thing anyway. It's interesting that. I'm just trying to think of all the other. I don't think there is another play with working class people in it, is there?
Obviously, the history plays have working class characters.
Well, yeah, of course, Falstaff and the girls.
Midsummer Night's Dream is the one where it's a major part of the play, and the finale is really half an hour of the mechanicals being magnificent. That's a big thing. Again, I think we take for granted a lot of what we think about Shakespeare on those scores. And that play in its own way was making quite a big statement about the humanity of working class people.
I've just, about pre-COVID, I did a play for Radio 4 called Play of the Heart, which we recorded in Anne Hathaway's cottage in Stratford, and the play was Shakespeare on his deathbed, where he's visited by the characters that he's written. It's a wonderful, wonderful play, and I lay on the bed for I think the bed, supposedly. What a freezing cold, late at night as well, but it was really extraordinary to do it. The play was nominated for a few awards, actually. It's a beautiful play, and I can't remember the name of the playwright, but it's worth, if your podcast and people who listen, you can try and get hold of it. It's actually really beautiful, very moving, because his children and his wife are there as he's dying, but he's visited by Lear, by Macbeth, by all the major characters that he's written in his head. Beautiful, beautiful play.
So going back to Hamlet for a second, we talked a little bit about the comedy in the play. How did you find yourself tackling the tragedy? Again, the journey you're describing is from an actor who was really at home with comedy, but obviously Hamlet is the great tragic part. How did you find your acting muscle stretched as you tackled him?
Well, it was a career-changing role, let's be honest. And as you said, it was a landmark production, and Graham Hall just tore it apart, in terms of props and scenery, and it laid me bare, which I found frightening at first. I mean, I was really frightened because there was nothing to hide behind. I had to show my soul, and I think that's probably what made it very, very moving, is that I tried so hard to disguise myself with comedy, and people could see the fact that I was trying to cover up, which is exactly what he's trying to do. He's trying to fight in his head, in his fight, everyone that he doesn't trust, and he starts to not trust himself and the person he loves. And so it got more and more moving. And I remember, and I've never experienced this, and I don't mind boasting about it, because, the cast used to say to me, Robert, did you see people crying at the end of the play? And I've seen Hamlet many, many times, and I don't think I've ever experienced or seen that before. And I think what Braham did with it was he just deliberately laid us bare. I had my own clothes on. I mean, not even rehearsal, just me. I came out as me. And I think there was a famous poem about it. In fact, Braham sent to me, which the poet talks of someone laid bare with nowhere to hide. How I managed to do it, I'll never know, but I think I have to congratulate Shakespeare and Braham and the Royal Exchange. I mean, the round really helped as well, because I always felt there were people behind my back. I mean, actually, it's very funny in many ways if you suddenly talking to someone and you feel there's someone behind you, which I did a lot.
For those who don't know, the Royal Exchange is the largest theatre in the round in the country, some like 700 plus seaters.
9, actually.
900, there we are.
Well, it was then. I don't know whether it is now, but yeah. And of course, the killing of Polonius. I mean, he sat in the audience. So I searched for him. So I'm now wandering around looking in the audience with a sword, looking for the man who is behind the arras. And the arras is the audience, which is a shocking moment. People were absolutely, you could see the look of horror on their faces as I'm trying to find him, hoping to God it's not them.
I think I know that Graham had a real mission with that production to strip away the paraphernalia of Shakespeare, or what Shakespeare had become. The idea that it all had to be in doublet and hose, that there was a style. And what you're describing is very much the idea that there should be no division between the piece of theatre on stage and the audience itself. And that immediacy is hard to find. But I know that I've directed one Shakespeare professionally, which was Romeo and Juliet, which I did with the young Andrew Garfield, who's now a big film star, and Gugu and Barter Raw. And I remember saying to the actors, everybody knows this play. Our goal is to get to the point where the audience forget they've seen it, forget they've read it. And we did achieve that. I remember we knew we'd achieved that when the audience reacted to the death of Tybalt and Mercutio. If they were shot, then we knew we'd done it. And I think there was one performance where a whole section of the audience almost jumped out of their seats onto the stage. And what you're describing of moving people to tears with Hamlet, to me, that should be what Shakespeare productions are aspiring to.
Yeah, but also I was given, because I was very physical as an actor, very both comedic and athletic. I did surprised even Braham and the cast by doing the most outrageous things, and I don't think I've ever played a role where I had complete freedom to do what I wanted, and a fantastic supporting cast who just went with me. And of course, the shock on the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern when I literally started walking backwards and then left them and climbed up into the first gallery and started running around the gallery. I'd never done that before, because I thought, I'll just do it because I could, because I'd been given the opportunity to do that. So we had an extremely comic moment with the two of them trying to have a conversation to a complete idiot who's running around the Royal Exchange. There were many, many moments like that. It wasn't a great cast. It was a great production. And I'm very, very proud of. It's just so tragic that we didn't film it in some way. I often see now productions that are filmed, which seems to be the big thing at the moment.
The technology's massively improved on that. And back in the 80s and the 90s, it was always very tinny. If you recorded and you couldn't
sure
live feel. But I think the technology of the live streaming that goes on now is much, much better. But I think always the live connection is what's going to be exciting, isn't it? It's being there with the actor in the room.
Oh, there is nothing like that. And I miss it. I've got a week in the Criterion, 2 weeks' time, doing Bleak Expectations, where literally I'm talking to the audience the whole evening. It's just they have a guest presenter each week, and I haven't done anything in theatre for a year. I've been out, but there is nothing like that. And with that language of Shakespeare, with those amazing characters, with an audience that you say when you either shock them, make them cry, or whatever, is such a joyous moment. I think Shakespeare and my theatre career has been the highlight of my career, let's put it that way.
That's wonderful to hear. Just briefly, you mentioned the language. For a lot of people, the language is a challenge. How did you crack it, and what advice would you give to people coming at the language for the first time?
I think you have to understand the words, because there are some very odd words, even to be or not to be. I remember going through, Braham was an academic, university educated, and he knew his Shakespeare terribly well. He could explain what fardels were. And I'm trying to think of the other strange words in it. The language in Cymbeline. Whoa. I had such a problem with that. And I went through every book But even when you read the sense of the words, sometimes you wonder what the sentence means. Once you start to break down the structure of it, once you let go, which is a phrase I use a lot, once you let go and you have an overall view of a speech, that's what my thing is, that suddenly it happens. That's why it's so well written. You can analyze for so long, and the secret is just to do it. And then when you've done it for a while, you suddenly realize you actually understand it.
It's capturing the spirit of it, isn't it? And I've always found when I'm directing Shakespeare that if the actor knows what they're saying, the audience will. They might not understand every single word, but they'll understand the spirit of it, and then it will come through.
Yeah, I mean, with acting is because, we spend most of our time fooling people and lying to people and disguising, but when you get to the real heart of something, it is, well, that's why you become an actor. That's the reason. You suddenly, and I keep saying that to my son who desperately wants to be a film star. I keep saying to him, the moment you touch someone, the moment you reach, even when your fellow actor, when you see a natural response from your fellow actor, when you see a response from the audience, and you've actually you've made contact, real contact with someone, then you know that you have a career.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation, and thank you for everything you've said. Just to finish up, is there some kind of final thing you'd like to say about Shakespeare that you want people to take away?
I've always felt it's all going back to what kids now feel and what I experienced taking Hamlet on tour all those years ago. It does reach people. It can touch people. I've seen it. I've experienced it. I still find even now in this day and age, for some reason, it's royal. We've had the coronation weekend recently, and, we know King Charles III is a great fan of Shakespeare. In fact, he came to my opening night of Richard III. It still has that elitist feel, and I just want kids to realize you get to the heart of Shakespeare and he will touch everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robert Lindsay.
Thank you.
That was Robert Lindsay sharing with us his experience of playing Shakespeare. To find out more about the Durham Shakespeare Festival 2023, go to our website, www.elysiumtc.co.uk.